Okay, strap yourselves in, folks.
Yeah.
Because today, we're going deep. We're talking the Cold War,
The Cold War.
a conflict that shaped the world for decades.
Yeah, decades.
And get this, the main players, the US and the Soviet Union, never actually fought each other directly in a big war.
Oh,
So what are we doing here today? We're uncovering the roots of this crazy rivalry, right, eh? We're going to see how they basically used other countries' conflicts.
like their own personal battlegrounds.
Exactly. And then we'll look at how how it continues to shape the way the U.S. deals with foreign policy even now.
And one of the most fascinating things about the Cold War, it happened so fast. I mean, it's crazy how quickly these two nations went from buddies in World War II,
Fighting side by side.
right, to like sworn enemies. It was practically overnight. And you have to remember, this wasn't just some military standoff. It was a clash of ideologies.
It was about totally different ways of looking at the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Democracy versus communism. And, well, that fundamental difference kind of set the stage for this global power struggle with incredibly high stakes.
And to make things even more intense, they literally drew a line across Europe. The Iron Curtain.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't just some metaphor, it was a real thing.
Very real.
Splitting Europe right down the middle.
You had Western Europe with the U.S. embracing democracy, capitalism.
And on the other side.
Eastern Europe under Soviet control, under the influence of communism.
So then where does Germany fit into all of this?
Germany, and especially Berlin, they became the most powerful symbol of this division.
Wow.
It's mind-blowing to think a single city could embody such a global conflict.
It's hard to imagine.
But the Berlin blockade, 1948 to 1949, that really brought the tension to life. The Soviets tried to basically starve out West Berlin, cut off all access by land. But the U.S., they responded with the Berlin airlift. It really was. For over a year, they flew in supplies day and night, showing they were committed to West Berlin, and showing the Soviets they wouldn't back down.
The Berlin airlift.
Yeah.
What a powerful example of resolve.
Hmm?
But how did the U.S. approach, like, the bigger picture of containing Soviet influence? It couldn't just be about sending supplies to one city.
No, it couldn't. That's where the containment theory comes in.
Okay.
That was the foundation of U.S. foreign policy during the entire Cold War. Think of it this way. The U.S. knew attacking the Soviet Union directly was way too dangerous, especially with the threat of nuclear war.
Right, always looming.
Exactly. So they focused on preventing communism from spreading.
Interesting.
And there were a couple of major examples of containment in action: the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan.
Okay, let's break those down.
So the Truman Doctrine, this was in response to conflicts in Greece and Turkey. The U.S. pledged support to any nation resisting communist pressure. And the Marshall Plan, even bolder. The U.S. pumped billions of dollars, into rebuilding Western Europe after World War II. Not just helping their economies, but also making them less vulnerable to communist ideology.
It sounds like the U.S. was playing the long game,
Yeah.
trying to build up a global alliance against communism. But this containment, it wasn't always about economic aid and politics, was it?
No, not always. Sometimes things got, well, a lot more heated.
That's what we're going to talk about when we come back.
The proxy wars.
You got it. Stay tuned.
We were talking about things getting a little heated.
Heated is an understatement.
Right.
We're talking proxy wars, conflicts where the U.S. and the Soviet Union never actually fought each other directly.
Right. They backed different sides in other conflicts, often with weapons, training, or financial aid. It was like fighting by proxy.
Yeah.
Using other countries as their battlegrounds.
And the two most significant examples are the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Both incredibly impactful, both incredibly complex.
Absolutely. The Korean War, that one raged from 1950 to 1953, started as a civil war, North versus South Korea.
Okay.
But then it quickly escalated. The Soviet Union and China backed the North,
And the U.S.?
backed the South, along with UN forces. It was a brutal conflict, millions of casualties. And ultimately, well, it ended in a stalemate. Korea divided at the 38th parallel.
Pretty much the same way it was before the war even started.
Right. But the human cost, immeasurable.
And then there's Vietnam,
Yeah.
a conflict that lasted even longer, 1955 to 1975.
Yeah.
And it had such a profound impact, not just on the countries involved, but on American society as a whole.
Yeah. Another case of the U.S. getting entangled in a proxy war against communism. They supported South Vietnam against the communist North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. It was a long and grueling conflict. The U.S. deployed hundreds of thousands of troops.
Wow.
And even with their military superiority, they faced fierce resistance. The North Vietnamese, amazing fighters, their guerrilla tactics made victory, well, pretty elusive.
Then back on.
Back home, the war divided the nation, fueled protests, draft dodging, you name it. It created a national debate about America's role in the world, a debate that I think continues to this day.
These proxy wars played out on such a global stage, like a giant chess game. Each superpower always trying to outmaneuver the other, and always with the threat of a direct confrontation in the background.
Right.
But there was another piece, a more terrifying one: nuclear weapons.
Right. The development and proliferation of nuclear weapons changed everything. Imagine living with the knowledge that a single decision could lead to global annihilation. It was a time of unprecedented danger, mutually assured destruction, it was called.
Wow.
Both sides knew if one launched a nuclear attack, the other would retaliate. And that meant unimaginable devastation. It was terrifying. It shaped every decision, every action.
And in 1962, the world came terrifyingly close to witnessing that nightmare scenario during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It doesn't get much closer than that.
No, it really doesn't.
So we were just talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right, the world was on edge.
On edge. I think that's putting it mildly.
Okay, yeah, maybe a bit of an understatement. I mean, the Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba.
90 miles from the U.S. mainland.
That's right. It was like a giant game of chicken with the highest possible stakes.
And for 13 days, the world held its breath.
Absolutely. It was one of those moments where you realize how fragile everything is, how quickly things could spiral out of control.
I can't even imagine the pressure Kennedy and Khrushchev must have felt.
Immense, I'm sure. But thankfully, cooler heads prevailed.
They did, in the end.
Through intense negotiations and some back-channel diplomacy, they found a solution. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba.
And the U.S.
They removed their own missiles from Turkey. That part was kept secret for a long time, but it was part of the deal. A victory for diplomacy, but man, a close call. It really showed just how fragile peace was in the nuclear age.
And this whole idea of living under the threat of nuclear war, I think we need to talk more about that. Like, what was that really like?
It was unlike anything else. It wasn't just the fear of a sudden catastrophic event. It was constant. This pervasive anxiety that seeped into everything. People built bomb shelters in their backyards. Schools practiced duck and cover drills.
Wow.
It was everywhere. Popular culture was full of images of nuclear annihilation. It was unsettling, to say the least.
It's hard to wrap my head around that, living with that kind of fear every day.
It's a testament to human resilience, that people found ways to cope and carry on.
But that shadow of the bomb.
It was always there, always lurking in the background.
Speaking of shadows, there was another competition going on between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. A little less terrifying, but still intense.
The space race.
That's right.
It's a fascinating part of the Cold War. It wasn't just about science and exploration, It was about showing the world who was superior technologically.
No.
A way to flex their muscles.
It was about bragging rights.
Exactly.
I remember reading about Sputnik.
Ah, Sputnik.
Launched in 1957. That must have been a shock to the American public.
It was a wake-up call. The Soviets had beaten the U.S. into space with the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth.
So what did the U.S. do?
They kicked into high gear. The space race became a national obsession, tons of investment in science and engineering education. The U.S. had to catch up, and fast.
And ultimately they did, right, with the Apollo program. And the moon landing.
That's right. The moon landing in 1969, a major victory for the U.S. and a huge source of national pride.
It's amazing to think about the advancements that came out of that competition. But it also makes you think about how technology in general was shaping society during the Cold War.
Yeah, technology's influence went way beyond just the military and politics. All those advancements in computing and telecommunications, initially driven by the Cold War, but they laid the foundation for the digital revolution we're seeing today.
It's crazy to think how those innovations born out of conflict have changed the way we live.
It's a wild thought, right? How we communicate, work, access information. It all goes back to those early days of the Cold War.
So all this was happening, this back and forth, this competition, this innovation, and then the Cold War came to an end. What happened? Why did the Soviet Union collapse in 1991?
There wasn't just one thing, it was a perfect storm, really. Decades of economic stagnation, for one.
The economy was struggling.
Big time. And there was internal pressure for reform, and then there was the Afghan war. It was all just too much.
I've also heard that Gorbachev's reforms, the ones that were supposed to save the Soviet Union, actually ended up speeding up its collapse.
Yeah, it's ironic, isn't it? Gorbachev, he wanted to revitalize the Soviet system with glasnost and perestroika,
Glasnost meaning.
openness, and perestroika meaning restructuring. But instead of saving the Soviet Union, they opened the floodgates. More freedom, sure, but also they revealed all those deep-seated problems.
So it backfired.
In a way, yes.
And of course, we can't forget the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989.
Such a powerful symbol.
A physical manifestation of the Soviet Empire crumbling.
And a sign of hope for those who had lived under its rule. But for the U.S., it was a whole new set of challenges and opportunities.
The U.S. was the sole superpower.
Mhm.
How did they handle that? How did it impact their foreign policy?
It was a time of major adjustment. No more single overarching enemy. They had to adapt.
So what did they do?
Well, in the 1990s, there was a focus on spreading democracy and free trade around the world.
Okay.
They also got involved in humanitarian interventions, like in Bosnia and Kosovo, trying to prevent ethnic cleansing, restore stability.
So they were trying to be the world's police.
In a way, yes. But there was also a growing awareness of new threats, like terrorism. That would become a major focus in the years to come.
So the end of the Cold War didn't exactly bring about world peace. It just changed the kind of conflicts the U.S. had to deal with.
Exactly. The world was still a dangerous place. And the U.S., they had to figure out how to navigate it without that familiar framework of the Cold War. But the Cold War's legacy, it continued to shape their thinking, how they interacted with other nations, responded to threats, approached global security.
It's amazing to think about how much the world transformed during and after the Cold War. It makes you wonder if we're seeing any parallels today.
Oh, there are definitely some echoes of the past. We see these rising tensions between the U.S., China, and Russia. Some are even calling it a new Cold War.
Interesting.
And the competition for technological dominance, especially in things like artificial intelligence, it feels a lot like the arms race of the past.
And then there's the threat of nuclear war. Maybe not as immediate as during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's still a very real concern.
Yeah, that's the thing about history. It doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes.
And that's why it's so important to learn from it so we don't make the same mistakes.
Right, exactly.
We've covered so much ground today, from the beginning of the Cold War to the collapse of the Soviet Union and all the ways it still impacts us today. But before we wrap up, there's one more thing I want to touch on. It's about how the Cold War affected culture, how both sides used it as a weapon in their ideological struggle.
Ah, the cultural Cold War. It's fascinating how music, fashion, art, it all became part of this global conflict.
So, like, what, blue jeans were a symbol of freedom?
Exactly. They were highly sought after in the Soviet bloc, even though they were often banned. And Western rock and roll music, that sparked underground movements despite attempts to suppress it.
It's amazing how everyday things took on such significance.
They became symbols of resistance, a yearning for something different. And the Soviets, they had their own cultural tools, propaganda films, socialist realist art, all promoting their vision of a perfect society.
It was a battle for hearts and minds, not just territories.
Exactly, a global battle of ideas playing out in the cultural arena. And even though it was full of tension, these cultural exchanges, they also exposed people to different ways of life.
So even in the midst of conflicts, there was a bit of human connection.
Exactly.
It's important to remember that the Cold War wasn't just about politics and military might. It was a cultural and ideological battle that left its mark on the entire world. From the clothes we wear to the music we listen to, the art we admire. Its influence is everywhere.
It was a truly multifaceted conflict, touching every aspect of life in both the East and the West.
And with that, we come to the end of our deep dive into the Cold War. It's been an incredible journey, exploring a period that shaped the world as we know it. We've seen how it all began, how it escalated, and how it ultimately ended, but also how its legacy continues to shape our world today.
And as we move forward, it's crucial to remember the lessons we've discussed today. The dangers of ideological conflicts, the power of diplomacy, and the importance of understanding before taking action.
The world is complex and interconnected, and the choices we make today will echo far into the future. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning from the past. Because the more we understand history, the better equipped we'll be to build a more peaceful and informed future. Thanks for joining us.